Hello and welcome to the Geopolitics and Business Briefing, the podcast where we unpack major geopolitical shifts and what they mean for companies operating across borders, together with the experts who analyze and track these developments every day. I am Theresa Terzer, and today we are talking about President Trump's state visit to Beijing, a trip that was postponed because of the Iran war. Ban took place from May 13 till 15, 26, with enormous symbolic weight, but as we will hear, surprisingly thin concrete outcomes. With me to walk through what has actually been said, what has been promised, and what still remains completely unresolved is my colleague Leonhard Xu. Leo, it is great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Leo, the state visit was originally postponed because of the Iran war, as I just said, and then took place with a lot of anticipation. Can you walk us through what happened? Where did Trump and Xi meet? Who was there? And how was the choreography set up?
Yeah, this was a highly choreographed state visit. Trump visited Beijing with a very large part of its cabinet, including Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Trade Representative Jameson Greer, but also Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Marco Rubio is an interesting case, given that he was previously sanctioned by China during his time as a senator. And the choreography, which I'm sure many of the listeners have already seen, at least snippets over social media, was really important here because both sides wanted to signal that the relationship continues to be under control, at least for now. And for Beijing, the symbolism was about both status and stability. Hosting Trump in this very formal, almost imperial setting allowed Xi to present China as an equal great power alongside Washington. And for Trump, this visit was more about deal making and personal diplomacy. And he wanted to show that this direct personal relationship with Xi can produce results or concrete results, mainly in the areas of trade, such as in agriculture. But the key point here is that the symbolism was much stronger than the substance, as you already alluded to. The summit created a sense of managed calm, but a lot of the big issues remain unresolved.
Now, when we look at the official statements, what stands out compared to Busan in October 25? I mean, you wrote an analysis, and in that analysis, you write that there was high symbolism, but it was light on deliverables. So, what's the evidence for that?
Yeah, the last meeting between Xi and Trump in South Korea in late 2025 was really about cooling down the temperature after both countries escalated their respective geo-economic arsenals to unprecedented levels last year. Just wanted to remind people that mutual tariff rates between the US and China at some point reached as high as 145%, and both sides announced major expansions of their respective export control regimes. And when Trump and Xi met in Busan last year, they produced a very clear list of measures by both sides on a series of items, including tariff reductions, export control suspensions, agricultural purchases, etc. And for this summit in Beijing, we and the rest of the world, we had to piece together what's been agreed from a combination of official readouts and then cabinet level interviews, both during the trip, after the trip, and the most recent US fact sheet was published unusually late, 3 days after the summit has ended. I think that tells you something about how much had to be finalized even after the leaders went home. Yeah, and it's what's included is not only a patchwork itself, but the language itself is also oftentimes much vaguer.
Now, Trump traveled with a major business delegation, including Elon Musk, Nvidia's Jensen Huang, Apple's Tim Cook, and the White House even talked about historic deals. So if we strip out all the political packaging and look strictly at the official readouts, what concrete trade items are actually on the table?
Yeah, if we strip out all the fancy language, you essentially get 5 main trade items. The first one is a mutual commitment by DC and Beijing to continue the implementation of what's been already agreed upon in previous rounds of trade negotiations and the Busan meeting. The second point is an in-principle agreement on mutual reciprocal tariff reduction on non-sensitive goods. U.S. Treasury Secretary Bessent has already talked in an interview about goods roughly worth 30 billion on each side, but that figure has not made it in any official readout, but it gives you a sense of the dimension which is under being discussion. The third concrete outcome is a commitment by China to buy at least $17 billion worth of US agricultural products each year until 2028, alongside with some mutual reductions in agricultural market access barriers. The concrete number did not feature in any Chinese readout, but prominently in the US readout. The fourth point is that China committed to buy additional Boeing aircraft from the US. And based on China's Ministry of Commerce, the US also committed to keep supplying engines and spare parts for Boeing aircraft to China. The US cited a figure of 200 Boeing airplanes for the first tranche, but again, the Chinese side did not highlight a specific number. And fifth, which is probably the most interesting, is that both sides agreed upon the creation of a so-called Board of Trade alongside a Board of Investment. And the Board of Trade is supposed to help the US and China manage bilateral trades across non-sensitive goods. And the Board of Investment is supposed to provide a forum for discussing investment-related issues between Washington and Beijing. The idea for these boats was first floated by US Trade Representative Greer in late March this year after I believe it was the 6 rounds of trade negotiations between the US and China. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi confirmed that the boards are being set up, but that the details are still being finalized at working level. At this stage, the Board of Trade and Investment does not look like a fundamentally new trade structure, but more of a institutionalization of the existing trade and investment consultation mechanism, under which the previous rounds of US-China trade negotiations took place since May 2025. So basically a way to give the current trade dialogue a more permanent structure. So each of these results are definitely real, and can help stabilize the bilateral relationship, but none of these measures should be interpreted as a fundamental rebalance of the bilateral relationship in any meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Now, the central phrase in Beijing's readout was constructive strategic stability. What exactly does that mean according to China's messaging, and what time frame is it meant to cover?
Yeah, Beijing presents this framing of constructive strategic stability between the US and China as a new paradigm for the bilateral relationship for the next 3 years and even beyond. The last US readout actually accepts this framing, but made no concrete statements about the time frame. And if you look at the time frame, of course, 3 years are the remainder of the Trump administration. Chinese President Xi explicitly framed this new paradigm as a guardrail against the Thucydides trap, an international relations concept that's simplified that relative rising powers and relative declining powers are historically prone to conflict. Two things are important to highlight here. I think the first one is that per the Chinese readout, it's one of the first times where Beijing now openly acknowledges that competition with the US exists and that it features prominently. So this is a quite major shift in tone. Earlier Chinese framings of the relationship tended to deny or minimize the competition narrative, at least officially. And now the message is pretty clear. Competition exists, but we want to keep it in a healthy, stable, and manageable format. And the second point to stress is that from Beijing's perspective, the framework is meant to extend the current economic trades, truce, or detente into a really multi-year framework for the remainder of Trump's term. And the strategic objective here is to create a new structural normal and buying itself more time for its progress on technological and scientific self-sufficiency, in particular in semiconductor and its manufacturing equipment and other choke point technologies, and thereby in the long run strengthening Beijing's bargaining position in case there's a new round of escalations again.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your analysis, you also write that she explicitly tied the concept you just mentioned to concrete actions on both sides. What does Beijing mean by concrete actions, and which US actions are being referenced here?
Yeah, so in every meeting with any US president or any other major head of government, Taiwan is, of course, very major piece of discussion for Beijing. And so the first condition or action Beijing has in mind is US restraint on Taiwan policy. And the second condition is on what Beijing views as unilateral US actions. And there are three recent measures by Washington that are bothering Beijing. The first one is a major piece of export control legislation moving through the US Congress, independently from the White House, important to note. It's called the Match Act, and it would significantly expand US export controls on semiconductor manufacturing technology and would force US allies, mainly the Netherlands and Japan, to comply with it. And China is quite worried and seriously unhappy with it. The second point is, or a second set of measures are a series of measures introduced or moving toward adoption by the US FCC, which restrict the sales of certain Chinese origin technology in the US market. And the third point is our recent sanctions on Chinese oil refineries related to the war in Iran, which have prompted China to invoke its blocking rules for the first time since its creation. And if Washington doubles down on any of these measures, particularly if the US Match Act is being implemented, Beijing would likely declare this framework void and re-escalate again on the export control front to force Washington to back down.
Okay. Now, as you said, Taiwan appears prominently in China's readout. What exactly did she say? And did the US side respond to that?
Yeah, it's unsurprising that Taiwan featured prominently. Even before the summit, she called Taiwan, quote, the most important issue in the bilateral relationship. And during the summit, the Chinese readout highlighted that she warned that the mishandling of the Taiwan issue could push relations into a, quote, very dangerous situation and potentially leading to clashes or even conflict. She also described Taiwanese independence and cross-strait peace as irreconcilable as fire and water, and he urged Washington to handle the issue with the utmost caution. So these are the official words from Xi. And while if we look at the U.S. reaction, the White House and cabinet officials emphasized that the official U.S. Policy on Taiwan has not changed. Trump gave an interview with Fox News and stated, and I'm quoting, "I'm not looking to have someone go independent." Here, Trump remained non-committal on any policy regarding future arms sales on Taiwan. So they were being discussed, but he stressed that Taiwan and arms sales to the island are a very good negotiating chip for the US.
Mm-hmm. You describe export controls as the most striking absence in both readouts. What's the status on those NVIDIA H200 approvals and actual deliveries?
Yeah, so the NVIDIA H200 chips are one part of the export control discussion. In the lead up to the summit, there were growing reports that the White House has cleared the sales of NVIDIA's H200 chips to around 10 Chinese firms. But despite these approvals, not a single chip has been delivered so far. Chinese firms paused their orders following guidance from Beijing. And US side confirmed that the issue of NVIDIA chip sales came up, but these were not a major point of discussion. And it's ultimately up to Beijing on whether to allow the purchase of these chips or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, the mutual export control suspension from Busan, the US affiliates rule, and China's 9 October package is set to expire in November 26. What did the summit produce on this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to flag this. The November deadline is one of the most important deadlines in this relationship at the moment. Just to remind you about the stakes of these export control packages. The US affiliates rule would extend existing US entity list restrictions to all entities owned 50% or more by Chinese entities, which effectively expands the scope of US export control restrictions to thousands of additional companies. And China's October 9th export control package in return added additional rare earth materials, battery materials, and related technologies and equipment to its export control regime. So it's quite a major expansion. And the only real export control reference in the official summit readouts appears in the final US fact sheet, which states that China will address US concerns over rare earth and critical minerals supply shortages, as well as some restrictions on the sales of rare earth equipment and technologies. The Chinese readout did not highlight any language on export controls besides a loose reference to continue to adhere to previous agreements. So the summit really produced neither an extension nor a successor framework. The two most consequential leverage points from both the US and China have essentially been pushed back to subsequent rounds of negotiations. The clock is really ticking here because both sides of the export control measures are set to expire in November. And if there's no extension agreed, the controls will be reinstated. And this would be highly disruptive for companies in sectors such as semiconductors, but also batteries, potentially automotive and clean tech. So quite an important day to watch.
Mm-hmm. So we mentioned one deadline. Which other deadlines should companies and observers mark in their calendars? When does it get serious?
Yeah, so I mean, the ultimate deadline is November 10th, but until then, the US and China will have plenty of opportunities to find agreement on this issue. As one major summit outcome, both sides also confirmed that Chinese President Xi will visit the US in fall 2026, with the likeliest date being around September 24th. Trump has issued an official invitation for Xi. And both sides also agreed to support each other for hosting this year's APEC summit, which takes place in Shenzhen in November, and also the G20 summit in Miami in December this year. And this would be after the November deadline, at least 2 summits. And it's also unclear whether they will meet again in person, but the visit to the US in September is a very likely outcome.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, last question. You characterize this as a managed truce rather than a fundamental strategic reset. Looking at all the official statements and also the unresolved leverage points, the possible follow-up meetings you just mentioned, what should we be watching for, let's say, the next 6 months?
Yeah, the good news is that the summit effectively extends the trade rules that's been holding since the Busan Agreement in October 2025. So these are the good news, and this makes a repeat of the sharp escalation we saw in 2025 less likely. Frictions will not go away, but both sides now have a strong interest in maintaining guardrails to prevent another destabilizing spiral. Two things to watch out for. concretely are first, what happens with the Match Act in US Congress, and if it moves through the Congress, will the US president eventually veto it, which would also create a lot of bipartisan pushback inside DC. The second one is on whether the US and China will find an extension or a follow-up agreement on export control suspensions. There are also a few other items worth tracking in the next coming weeks and months. One of them, for instance, is whether the US will delist the sanctioned Chinese oil refineries from its sanctions list. And taken together, these examples really show that the relationship between the US and China still remains in a fragile equilibrium. The summit did not provide a durable settlement on the structural drivers of competition. The current stability is more of a reflection of a geo-economic stalemate that defines 2025. Both sides still retain significant leverage and the ability to impose serious economic costs on the other sides, but currently both sides prefer not to use it. And in the coming months and years, both sides are very likely to use this breathing room to accelerate mutual de-risking in critical sectors. For China, this means pressing ahead with technological and scientific self-sufficiency. To weaken US choke point technologies or the stranglehold the US has in these respects. And for the US, it means continued efforts to reduce dependencies on Chinese rare earths and critical minerals. And I think one last point that's important to make, particularly for European listeners, is that stability in the bilateral US-China relationship can prevent some collateral damage to European businesses, but it does not guarantee stability in either country's trade relationship with third parties, such as the EU. And it's particularly relevant because trade tensions between Brussels and Beijing are ratcheting up again.
Leo, thank you so much for walking us through the official statements and also sharing all your insights with us. If you would like to read the full analysis and also a topic-by-topic comparison of US and Chinese statements, you can find it on Geolytics Hub. If you have any feedbacks or topic you would like us to cover, feel free to reach out at podcast@geo-lytics.com. So thank you for listening, and we will see you next time in the Geopolitics and Business Briefing room. Bye-bye.
Bye.